The dog refused to leave the airport bathroom, and after 10 minutes of nonstop crying, even the TSA officers stopped laughing. Travelers at Terminal 4 in JFK had been complaining for nearly half an hour about the strange German shepherd blocking the hallway near Gate B22. Some thought the animal was aggressive. Others assumed it was sick. But the moment airport volunteer Sarah Mitchell knelt beside the dog's crate, her expression changed completely. The dog wasn't growling. It wasn't barking. It was staring at the automatic entrance doors with wide, trembling eyes, letting out a low whine every few seconds like it was waiting for someone who never came back. "How long has he been doing this?" Sarah asked quietly. One of the airline workers shrugged. "Since the plane landed from Istanbul. He was calm the whole flight. Then the second he got off the cargo lift, he started acting like this." The dog's name was Max. According to the paperwork attached to the crate, he had traveled more than 6,000 miles from northern Iraq to New York City through a military rescue organization. The journey had taken almost 3 days, with multiple layovers, medical checks, and quarantine clearances. But none of that explained why the animal suddenly looked terrified to move another inch. Sarah slowly reached toward the crate door, expecting Max to retreat. Instead, the dog pressed himself against the metal bars so hard that the entire carrier rattled across the tile floor. His breathing became frantic. Not angry, panicked. A nearby child covered his ears when Max suddenly let out a sharp cry that echoed through the terminal. Several people turned to look. Even Officer Raymond Cole from airport security paused mid-conversation when he noticed tears running down Sarah's face. "That dog's not scared of us," she whispered. "He thinks somebody abandoned him again." The words hung in the air uncomfortably. Sarah had worked with rescued military dogs for years, and she knew trauma when she saw it. Dogs like Max often formed deep emotional bonds with handlers overseas, especially in war zones where survival depended on trust. But something about this case felt different. Max wasn't simply anxious. He looked heartbroken. Sarah checked the intake file again. Beneath the transport information and vaccination records was a short handwritten note from a rescue worker in Iraq. "Please do not let him wait alone too long. He doesn't handle goodbyes well." Sarah swallowed hard after reading it. Before she could say another word, Max suddenly froze. Completely still. His ears lifted. His eyes locked onto the crowd near the terminal entrance. At first, nobody noticed the man standing there. He looked ordinary. Mid-40s. Dark baseball cap. Gray jacket. One duffel bag hanging from his shoulder. But the second Max saw him, the dog's entire body started shaking so violently that the crate door began slamming against the lock. Officer Cole stepped forward immediately. "Ma'am, back away from the animal." But Sarah didn't move, because the man at the terminal entrance wasn't walking toward the dog anymore. He had stopped completely, and from nearly 50 feet away, with hundreds of strangers moving between them, the man looked like he had just seen a ghost. The man near the terminal entrance did not move for several seconds. Neither did the dog. The entire hallway seemed trapped in a strange silence while travelers pushed suitcases past them without understanding what they were seeing. Then Max slowly lowered himself onto the floor inside the crate, his eyes never leaving the stranger across the terminal. The violent shaking stopped, but somehow that made the scene even more unsettling. Sarah glanced between the dog and the man, expecting one of them to react, but the stranger only tightened his grip on the duffel bag hanging from his shoulder before turning away toward a row of empty seats near the windows. "Do you know him?" Officer Cole asked quietly. The man hesitated before answering. "I'm not sure anymore." His voice sounded exhausted, rough in a way that made Sarah think he had not slept much recently. Before anyone could ask another question, Max let out a deep whine and crawled toward the front of the crate again, pressing his nose through the metal door so hard it left faint marks against his fur. Sarah slowly crouched beside him. "Hey, buddy," she whispered gently. "You are okay now." But Max did not look at her. His eyes remained fixed on the man sitting by the windows. It was not excitement Sarah saw in the dog's face. It was fear of losing someone all over again. After a few minutes, Sarah guided the crate into a quieter employee hallway away from the crowds. Max followed reluctantly, constantly looking backward as though terrified the stranger might disappear if he lost sight of him for even a second. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead while airport carts rolled past in the distance. Inside the quieter corridor, Sarah finally opened the crate door. Max stepped out slowly, his paws trembling against the polished floor. Up close, the dog looked older than the intake papers suggested. His tan and black coat was patchy in places. A long faded scar crossed one shoulder beneath the fur, and his ribs showed slightly whenever he breathed. But what stood out most was the exhaustion in his eyes. Sarah had seen rescue dogs arrive from all over the world, but most reacted to freedom with curiosity or relief. Max reacted like an animal waiting for bad news. He refused food. He ignored water. Even when Sarah rolled a tennis ball gently toward him, he barely glanced at it before returning to the hallway entrance to stare toward the terminal again. "He has been like this since Baghdad," said Dr. Olivia Turner, the veterinarian accompanying the transport team. She walked over holding a thin medical folder under one arm. The volunteers in Iraq said he slept beside airport gates whenever they moved him between checkpoints. He never stayed calm unless somebody sat next to him. Sarah frowned softly. "Did they say who?" Olivia shook her head. "No. But every time somebody wearing military boots walked past him, he reacted." Sarah looked back at Max. The dog was lying near the wall now, but his ears kept twitching toward distant footsteps echoing through the terminal, like he was listening for one specific sound hidden among thousands of strangers. A few minutes later, Officer Cole returned holding a small black backpack. "The man by the windows left this behind," he explained. "Said he would come back for it." Sarah barely paid attention at first until Max suddenly stood up so fast that his nails scraped loudly against the tile floor. The dog stared directly at the backpack. Then, for the first time since landing in America, Max began crying again. Quietly this time. Soft broken sounds that made the hallway feel unbearably empty. Sarah slowly unzipped the bag, expecting clothes or paperwork inside. Instead, sitting carefully folded near the top was a faded red leash with one word stitched into the handle in worn black thread. Sarah slowly lifted the faded red leash from the backpack, while Max stood completely motionless beside her. The dog was no longer crying. He was staring at the leash with an intensity that made the tiny hallway feel strangely tense. Maybe it belonged to his handler, Officer Cole suggested quietly. But before Sarah could answer, Max suddenly spun in a tight circle and pressed himself against the wall so hard that a metal cleaning cart rattled beside him. Everyone froze. The dog's breathing became shallow and uneven as his eyes darted wildly toward the hallway entrance again. Then came the sound. Heavy footsteps. Slow. Rhythmic. Somebody walking through the terminal wearing boots. Max immediately dropped flat against the floor. Not aggressive. Not defensive. Terrified. Sarah had never seen anything like it. The second the footsteps faded into the distance, Max cautiously stood again and walked back toward the backpack. He nudged it once with his nose. Then again, over and over, as though he desperately needed someone to open it wider. "What is he looking for?" Olivia murmured. Sarah carefully searched the bag again. Inside were only a few ordinary things. A half-empty water bottle, a folded sweatshirt, a small travel razor. But hidden beneath the clothing was an old photograph bent at the corners from years of use. Sarah pulled it free slowly. The image showed a younger version of the man from the terminal sitting on a concrete barrier somewhere overseas. Beside him sat Max, noticeably thinner and younger, with one paw resting on the man's boot. The dog instantly reacted. He backed away from the photo and let out a sharp, distressed sound, before pacing tight circles around the hallway. "Okay," Officer Cole said under his breath. "This is getting weird." Max completed 3 frantic circles before stopping directly beneath a wall-mounted television showing muted airport news coverage. His ears lifted sharply. The dog tilted his head once. Then he began scratching at the floor beneath the television over and over. Sarah walked closer, confused. On screen, a reporter was discussing flight delays caused by storms moving across the East Coast. Nothing unusual. Yet Max kept pawing at the tile with increasing desperation, his nails clicking rapidly against the ground. Suddenly, he darted away from the television and rushed toward the employee exit door leading back into the terminal. The leash was still hanging from Sarah's wrist when Max grabbed the end of it gently between his teeth and pulled hard toward the door. "He wants something," Sarah whispered. Officer Cole frowned. "Or somebody." They followed cautiously as Max moved through the crowded terminal with strange urgency. But the behavior growing in the dog now did not look normal anymore. He was not searching randomly. He ignored hundreds of travelers completely while weaving through the airport, as if following an invisible path only he understood. Twice he stopped abruptly beside men wearing dark jackets, only to recoil seconds later and continue forward. At one point, he stood outside a coffee stand trembling uncontrollably while staring at a businessman talking loudly on his phone in Arabic. The man glanced down nervously before stepping away. Nearby travelers began noticing the tension building around the dog. Some moved their children aside. Others whispered uneasily. One woman asked if the animal was dangerous. Sarah tried to calm everyone, but even she could feel something deeply unsettling forming. Max suddenly stopped near an escalator leading down toward baggage claim. His body stiffened completely. Slowly, almost mechanically, the dog lowered himself onto the floor. Then he began placing one paw repeatedly over his own eyes. Again, again, again. What is he doing? Olivia whispered. Nobody answered, because at that exact moment, the man from the terminal reappeared at the bottom of the escalator, carrying another bag in his hand. And the second Max saw him, the dog let out a low sound so human and broken that several people nearby physically turned around in shock. The sound Max made near the escalator changed the atmosphere of the entire terminal in seconds. Conversation stopped. A little girl near the baggage carousel grabbed her mother's hand and stared nervously at the trembling German shepherd. Even Officer Cole looked unsettled now. The dog was not acting aggressive, but there was something deeply disturbing about the way he reacted to the man at the bottom of the escalator. It was too emotional, too intense. The stranger froze when he heard Max crying. For a brief moment, it looked as if he might walk closer. But instead, he slowly stepped backward. That was when Max completely lost control. The dog suddenly lunged forward with such force that Sarah nearly lost grip of the leash. Gasps echoed through the terminal as Max dragged her several feet across the polished floor, his eyes locked entirely on the man near baggage claim. "Pull him back," somebody shouted. "Get that dog under control." Officer Cole immediately stepped between the crowd and Max, while another security worker moved people away from the escalator. But Max was not trying to attack anyone. He was desperately trying to reach the stranger before he disappeared again. The problem was that nobody around him understood that. The dog's panic looked dangerous from the outside. His body shook violently. His breathing sounded rough and uneven. He kept pulling toward the man while making those strange broken cries deep in his throat. Travelers began recording with their phones. A woman nearby whispered that the dog looked traumatized. Another man muttered that military dogs sometimes became unstable after combat zones. The stranger himself looked shaken now. He tightened his jaw and slowly raised his hands as if trying to calm the situation, but instead of helping, that only made Max react harder. The dog abruptly stopped pulling and crouched low against the floor, ears pinned back tightly, as though bracing for something terrible. Sarah's heart sank. She had seen rescue dogs panic before, but never like this. "Max," she whispered softly, "please calm down." But the dog was no longer listening to her voice. His entire focus remained trapped on the stranger. Every time the man shifted his weight or moved slightly, Max reacted instantly, almost fearfully, like an animal waiting for permission to breathe. "This is not safe," another airport officer said firmly while approaching Cole. "We have families here. If that dog snaps, somebody could get hurt." Sarah turned quickly. "He is not aggressive." "Maybe not intentionally," the officer replied. "But look at him." Sarah looked down at Max and felt her stomach tighten. From the outside, the dog truly did look unstable now. His paws kept sliding against the tile. Foam gathered slightly around his mouth from stress. His eyes were glassy and exhausted. To strangers, it did not look like grief anymore. It looked unpredictable. The officer lowered his voice. "The transport organization did not mention behavior problems?" Olivia stepped forward immediately. "No history of aggression. His records are clean." "Then why is he reacting like this to that man?" Nobody had an answer, and the silence itself began making people more nervous. The stranger finally spoke for the first time since reappearing near baggage claim. "Maybe I should leave." Max reacted instantly. The second those words left the man's mouth, the dog let out a sharp, desperate cry and twisted so violently against the leash that the clasp snapped loose from Sarah's hand. Panic exploded through the terminal. Max bolted forward several feet before skidding to a stop directly in front of the stranger. But instead of jumping or barking, the dog slowly lowered himself onto the cold airport floor and placed his head over the man's boots without moving. The entire terminal went silent again. Then the stranger whispered something that made Sarah's blood run cold. "He only does that when he thinks somebody is about to disappear forever." Officer Cole's expression hardened immediately. He turned toward the other security staff and spoke into his radio. "Animal control needs to come down here now. We may need to remove the dog from the airport." The words hit Sarah harder than she expected. "He only does that when he thinks somebody is about to disappear forever." The stranger said it quietly, almost like a confession he regretted saying out loud. Around them, airport staff were already shifting into emergency mode. Officer Cole spoke urgently into his radio while another employee began clearing people farther away from the baggage area. But Sarah could not stop staring at Max. The dog had not moved from the stranger's feet. His body remained pressed low against the floor, trembling faintly, but there was no aggression in him now, only exhaustion and fear, a deep fear that seemed older than the airport itself. "Sir," Officer Cole said carefully to the stranger, "I need you to step away from the animal." The man hesitated. That hesitation lasted less than 2 seconds, but Sarah noticed something strange immediately. Max reacted before the man even moved. The dog's ears twitched first. Then his breathing changed, almost as if he already knew what the stranger was about to do before his body actually did it. The man slowly stepped backward. Max instantly stood and followed one step behind him without pulling or resisting. Perfectly synchronized. Sarah frowned softly. Dogs could recognize familiar people, yes. But this was different. It looked practiced, conditioned, like the animal had spent years studying tiny movements from this specific person alone. "Sir, stop moving," Officer Cole warned. The stranger froze again. So did Max. Sarah's eyes narrowed. Something about the interaction felt wrong in a way she could not explain yet. Then she noticed the stranger's left hand. Every few seconds, almost unconsciously, his thumb tapped twice against the side of his leg. Tap, tap. A tiny nervous habit most people would never notice. But each time he did it, Max's tail gave a faint twitch against the floor. Sarah's heartbeat slowed. She had seen trained service dogs respond to subtle hand signals before, but this was beyond training. Max was reacting to movements so small they were almost invisible. "What is your name?" Sarah asked quietly. The man looked uncomfortable. "Now, Daniel." The second the name left his mouth, Max let out another low cry and pressed himself tightly against Daniel's boots again. Nearby passengers exchanged nervous glances. To them it probably looked like unstable attachment. But Sarah suddenly remembered something else from the intake papers. During transport from Iraq, the rescue volunteers repeatedly noted that Max refused commands from everyone except one unknown person. They assumed the dog was traumatized. Now she was not so sure. Officer Cole stepped closer to Daniel. "Do you know this dog or not?" Daniel looked down at Max for a long moment before answering. "I used to." The sentence made Sarah's stomach tighten. Used to. Not own. Not train. Not handle. Used to. Before anybody could press him further, an airport employee approached carrying the transport kennel paperwork Sarah had dropped earlier during the chaos. Several forms had scattered loose across the floor. "Ma'am, these fell out." Sarah took the papers distractedly, but one page immediately caught her attention. It was not part of the official transport records. It looked older, creased from being folded many times. At the top was a faded veterinary evaluation from nearly 6 years earlier. Most of the writing was barely readable, except for one line highlighted in yellow marker. Subject displays severe separation response when removed from primary companion. Sarah slowly looked up at Daniel again. Why would a rescue group send a dog halfway across the world to somebody he supposedly only used to know? Daniel's face changed instantly. Not anger, not surprise. Guilt. Real guilt. Before he could answer, Max suddenly lifted his head and stared toward the terminal windows. A thunderstorm had begun outside, rain hammering hard against the glass. The loud crack of thunder echoed faintly through the airport. Max reacted violently. But instead of hiding or panicking randomly, the dog spun around and shoved himself directly between Daniel and the terminal windows as if trying to shield him from something outside. Sarah felt cold all over. Then she quietly folded the old veterinary paper and looked at Officer Cole. "Do not call animal control." Yet, she said carefully. I think we are missing something important here. Officer Cole stared at Sarah for a moment before lowering the radio from his mouth. Around them, the airport noise continued in strange contrast to the tension near baggage claim. Rain hammered the windows harder now, flashes of lightning briefly illuminating the terminal in pale white bursts. But Max never moved away from Daniel. The dog remained positioned directly between him and the glass, as if protecting him from something only he understood. Sarah slowly stepped closer. Daniel, she said carefully, what happened in Iraq? Daniel did not answer immediately. His eyes stayed fixed on Max, and for the first time since anyone had seen him in the terminal, the man looked genuinely shaken. Not nervous about security. Not embarrassed. Haunted. He was never supposed to come here, Daniel finally whispered. Sarah frowned. What does that mean? Daniel swallowed hard before speaking again. I told them not to send him to me. The words stunned everyone nearby. Olivia blinked in confusion. You refused him? Max reacted instantly to the tone in Daniel's voice. The dog turned and pressed himself harder against Daniel's legs, whining softly now, almost desperately. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. 6 years ago, after I left Iraq, Max stopped functioning around other handlers. They tried retraining him, tried relocating him. Nothing worked. Every time somebody got too close to me, he reacted. Officer Cole crossed his arms carefully. Reacted how? Daniel looked down at the floor. He would panic before I did. Silence followed. Sarah's brow tightened. What are you talking about? Another crack of thunder shook the terminal windows. Max instantly spun around again and shoved his body against Daniel's knees hard enough to nearly knock him backward. Then Sarah noticed something terrifyingly strange. Daniel himself had not reacted to the thunder yet. But exactly 3 seconds later, his hands suddenly began shaking violently. He grabbed the nearby railing for balance as his breathing became uneven. Olivia stepped forward immediately. Sir. Daniel's face had gone pale now. Not emotional pale. Medical pale. Max whined sharply and stood upright beside him, nudging Daniel's hand repeatedly with his nose in a very specific rhythm. 1 nudge. Pause. 2 nudges. Pause. Again. Again. Sarah's eyes widened. This was not random behavior. Max was trying to interrupt something. Daniel's breathing worsened. His eyes darted around the crowded terminal as though the walls themselves were closing in around him. Then Sarah finally understood. Oh my God, she whispered. Daniel was not afraid of Max. Max was responding to Daniel. Olivia moved quickly. Sir, sit down. But before anyone could help him, Daniel suddenly collapsed to one knee beside the baggage carousel, struggling to breathe through what looked like a severe panic episode. Travelers nearby stopped completely. Max immediately moved in front of Daniel again, blocking the crowd from getting too close while gently pressing his head against the man's chest. Not aggressive, protective, deliberate. Sarah felt chills spread through her arms as the pieces finally connected in her mind. The trembling, the lunging, the crying, the constant tracking of Daniel's movements. Max had never been unstable. He had been monitoring Daniel the entire time. Every strange behavior in the airport had happened seconds before Daniel himself showed signs of distress. The thunder, the footsteps, the crowded terminal, the fear of abandonment. Max had not been reacting to danger around him. He had been reacting to Daniel's worsening emotional state before anybody else could even see it. Olivia knelt beside Daniel carefully. How long have you been having these attacks? Daniel tried to answer, but could barely speak through his breathing. Max gently pawed at Daniel's arm again in the same repeated rhythm until the man slowly matched his breathing to the dog's movements. Inhale. Pause. Exhale. Pause. Within seconds, Daniel's shaking began easing slightly. Officer Cole stared in disbelief. The dog is calming him down. Sarah looked at Max, suddenly horrified by how wrong they all had been. The dog they almost removed from the airport had not been dangerous at all. He had crossed thousands of miles because he was still trying to protect. The same broken man he never stopped watching over. The terminal no longer felt chaotic after the truth came out. It felt heavy, quiet in a way that made every sound seem personal. The rolling suitcase wheels, the distant boarding announcements, the rain against the giant windows. People who had been recording moments earlier slowly lowered their phones one by one, their expressions changing from fear to discomfort. Several passengers looked away entirely, embarrassed by how quickly they had judged the trembling German shepherd lying beside Daniel. Max stayed pressed against him on the airport floor, watching every small movement in the man's face with exhausting concentration. The dog's body still shook faintly, but now Sarah understood why. He had not relaxed once since arriving in America, because Daniel himself had never relaxed. Olivia handed Daniel a cup of water, while Officer Cole quietly stepped back from the scene, suddenly seeming unsure what to do with his own hands. A few minutes earlier, he had nearly called animal control. Now he could barely look at Max without guilt crossing his face. Daniel finally managed to steady his breathing enough to speak. He used to do this overseas too, he said weakly, his fingers resting against Max's neck. Before every panic episode. Before every nightmare. Before I even realized what was happening. Sarah slowly sat beside them on the cold terminal floor. And you still told them not to bring him here. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Because I thought he deserved a normal life. His voice cracked softly. Not this. Max immediately lifted his head at the sound of pain in Daniel's voice and gently nudged his chin beneath Daniel's hand until the man touched him again. It was automatic. Instinctive. Like the dog could not emotionally settle until he felt Daniel respond. Sarah felt tears sting her eyes unexpectedly. Suddenly, every strange moment from earlier replayed differently in her mind. The trembling near the terminal entrance. The desperate crying when Daniel tried to leave. The way Max positioned himself between Daniel and the thunderstorm. Even the scratching beneath the television suddenly made sense. The loud airport sounds had not been confusing the dog. He had been tracking triggers that overwhelmed Daniel emotionally. Max had spent hours trying to manage a human being who was silently falling apart in the middle of a crowded airport. And nobody had realized it. Nearby, one elderly woman who had earlier moved her grandchildren away from the dog slowly approached, holding a small stuffed bear from an airport gift shop. She crouched carefully a few feet away and set it quietly on the floor near Max without saying a word. The dog glanced at it briefly before returning his attention to Daniel again. The woman wiped tears from her face before walking away. Officer Cole stared down at the broken leash still lying near the baggage carousel. Without saying anything, he bent down, picked it up carefully, and handed it back to Sarah. I was wrong, he admitted quietly. Sarah nodded softly but did not answer. Because Max still had not fully relaxed. The dog kept watching Daniel with painful focus, almost like he was afraid the man might disappear if he blinked too long. Olivia finally looked directly at Daniel. You know this dog cannot go back into transport after this. Daniel's expression tightened immediately. I never wanted him dragged across the world again. Then do not let it happen, Olivia replied gently. Daniel looked down at Max for a long moment. The dog slowly rested his head across Daniel's knee again, exhausted beyond words, yet still trying to stay alert for him. Around them, the airport crowd had begun moving normally again, but something about the scene remained emotionally frozen in place. Sarah suddenly realized Max had probably spent years waiting for this exact moment without understanding whether it would heal him or destroy him. Daniel swallowed hard before finally whispering the words Max seemed to have waited years to hear. You are coming home with me this time. The second Daniel said it, Max closed his eyes for the first time since stepping off the plane. Nearly an hour later, the storm outside still had not stopped, but the atmosphere around baggage claim had completely changed. The airport staff, who once stood cautiously away from Max now, moved quietly around him with a strange gentleness, as if everyone understood they were standing near something fragile and important. Daniel sat beside the large terminal windows wrapped in an airport emergency blanket while Olivia finished checking his pulse and blood pressure. Max never left his side once. Even when Sarah brought over fresh water and food from an employee lounge, the dog refused to touch any of it until Daniel accepted a sip first. Only then did Max slowly lower his head to the water bowl and drink for the first time since arriving in America. Sarah watched silently, feeling something in her chest tighten. It was not obedience. It was trust. Real trust. The kind built over years of surviving fear together. A maintenance worker eventually arrived to clean the scattered papers and broken leash left near the baggage carousel earlier. But instead of throwing the damaged leash away, Officer Cole quietly stopped him. Give me a minute, he said. 10 minutes later, Cole returned carrying something unexpected. During his break, he had walked through 3 airport gift shops searching for supplies. In his hands was a brand new leather leash, dark brown with a brass buckle polished so brightly it reflected the overhead lights. Attached near the handle was a small metal tag he had asked an airport engraver kiosk to make immediately. Cole crouched slowly beside Max, no longer treating him like a threat. "I think this belongs to you now," he said softly. Daniel looked stunned as Cole clipped the new leash gently onto Max's collar. Engraved into the brass tag were 4 simple words: "Still watching over him." Sarah had to turn away briefly after reading it, because suddenly the entire exhausting day hit her emotionally at once. The fear, the misunderstanding, the way Max had carried Daniel's pain silently through an entire airport while everyone assumed the dog was the problem. Nearby passengers who had remained waiting for delayed flights quietly began approaching one by one. Not crowding, not interrupting, just leaving small things near Max without asking for attention. A folded airport neck pillow, a soft blanket from a little boy wearing a Yankees cap. A package of beef jerky from an older truck driver stranded by the storm. Max barely looked at the gifts themselves, but each time somebody approached calmly, the dog's posture relaxed a little more. It was as if he was slowly relearning that unfamiliar people did not always mean danger or separation. Hours earlier, every movement in the airport had made him panic. Now, for the first time, Max rested fully against Daniel's leg without scanning the terminal every few seconds. Daniel noticed it too. "He has not done that in years," he whispered quietly. Sarah sat beside them again. "Done what?" Daniel gently stroked Max's ears. "Fallen asleep around strangers." Sarah looked down in surprise. Max's eyes were closed now, fully closed. His breathing had slowed into deep, steady rhythms, while the thunderstorm continued outside unnoticed. Even the loudspeaker announcements overhead no longer made his ears twitch nervously. Daniel reached into the old backpack beside him and carefully removed the faded red leash they had carried all the way from Iraq. Sarah finally noticed something stitched beneath Max's name on the worn fabric handle. In tiny, nearly faded thread were the words "Return to me." Daniel swallowed hard after seeing it again. "I wrote that 6 years ago," he admitted quietly. "I think part of me hoped he would somehow find his way back someday." Sarah smiled softly through tears. "Looks like he never stopped trying." The airport lights dimmed slightly as evening settled outside the storm clouds, and Max shifted once in his sleep before pressing his head more firmly against Daniel's knee. Then, for the first time since anyone at the airport had met him, the dog's body finally became completely still. 3 months later, people at Denver International Airport began noticing a quiet routine near Terminal C every Thursday morning. Around 8 o'clock, a large German shepherd wearing a dark service vest would walk calmly beside a man carrying 2 paper coffee cups. The dog no longer trembled at loud announcements. He no longer panicked when strangers rolled suitcases past him. Instead, Max moved through the crowded terminal with slow confidence, occasionally glancing back at Daniel the same way a person checks whether someone they love is still beside them. Most travelers never knew the full story. They only noticed small things. The way airport employees always greeted the dog first. The way Officer Cole sometimes stopped by during his shift just to scratch behind Max's ears before laughing that the dog had become more popular than the pilots. Even Sarah visited whenever she could. She once joked that Max probably had more friends at the airport than anyone else in the building. But the biggest change happened quietly inside Daniel himself. Before Max returned, Daniel rarely left his apartment unless absolutely necessary. Crowded places overwhelmed him. Sudden sounds sent his mind spiraling back into memories he could not escape. Yet somehow the same dog everyone once feared in that terminal had slowly begun giving him pieces of his life back again. Not through miracles. Not overnight. Through ordinary moments. Max resting his head against Daniel's foot during difficult mornings. Max gently nudging his hand whenever his breathing changed too fast. Max guiding him away from noisy crowds before panic could fully take hold. The dog never stopped watching him. But now it no longer felt like fear. It felt like partnership. One snowy afternoon in December, Daniel returned to the airport with Max for something unexpected. Using donations quietly collected by airport staff and travelers after the incident months earlier, Sarah and Olivia had helped create a small support program for returning rescue animals and struggling veterans traveling through Colorado. Nothing large. Just a quiet room near the terminal with soft lighting, comfortable chairs, water bowls, blankets, and volunteers trained to recognize emotional distress in both humans and animals. They called it the layover room. On opening day, Daniel stood near the entrance feeling visibly nervous while Max sat calmly beside him wearing the same brass tag Officer Cole had given him months earlier. Still watching over him, a young Marine entered the room, first carrying a small rescue dog tucked under one arm. The man looked exhausted in a way Daniel recognized. Instantly, he hesitated awkwardly before sitting down across from Max. For several minutes nobody spoke. Then the small rescue dog slowly climbed into Max's bed and curled against his side. Max did not move away. He simply rested his chin gently over the smaller dog, as if silently, saying, "You are safe here now." Daniel looked down at the scene and suddenly laughed under his breath for the first time in years. Not the polite kind of laugh people force in public. A real one. Warm. Unguarded. Sarah noticed tears gathering in Olivia's eyes across the room. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home and snow drifted softly outside the airport windows, Daniel sat alone beside Max inside the quiet layover room. The overhead lights were dim. Planes moved silently beyond the glass. Max slept peacefully near Daniel's chair while one paw rested lightly against his boot, as if even in sleep he still needed to know Daniel was there. Daniel looked down at the old faded red leash folded carefully beside him and whispered something so quietly that almost nobody would have heard it. "You spent 6 years trying to find your way back to me." Max opened his eyes briefly at the sound of Daniel's voice, then relaxed again without fear. And in that silent little room beside the runway lights, Daniel finally understood something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Sometimes the ones carrying us through the darkest parts of life are already walking quietly beside us.